Hey guys, what is up? Super K-Man Rocks here, and we are finally back with my weekly reviews here for the LPL. It is time to start the summer split. We are back into the groove of things. Of course, a big format change going into summer here. If you want to know more thoughts on what I think of this format change, if you want an explainer a bit, you can check out the video up in the iCard right now. That's going to be my primer video for the LPL going into the summer split. Not only is there a big format explainer, of course, in that video where I talk about, kind of what I'm expecting from all of these teams, but I also power rank every single one of these teams within their group, and I talk about all of these teams from number 17 to number 1. I power rank all these players. If you want an overview of everything you can expect from the LPL this year, that's a really good place to start. I definitely recommend checking out that video. I know it's long, but check out the parts that you want to see when you want to see it. If you're interested in specific teams, you can skip around. All of that stuff is timestamped in the description. But today we are going to be going over everything that happened in week 1 of this placement qualification series, the start of the regular season and the group stage, if you really want to call it that. So I'm excited. I hope you guys are as well. If you are, let me know down in the comments section below. What did you expect from week number 1? Were there any upsets? Were you surprised by how some of these teams looked? I'm always interested to hear how you guys feel about these games, but without further ado, let's jump right into it. Typically speaking, we wouldn't jump around with all of these groups, but I'm going to treat this like the regular season. I'm going to treat this, just going day by day. I will be giving a player of the series and a dud of the series for each series that we talk about at the end of the week. I will be giving a player of the week and a dud of the week to kind of tie everything into a nice, neat little bow. And of course, we will also be updating my personal power rankings at the end of the video from number 1 to number 17. But that's the end of the video. Of course, we have to go through every single series before that, so let's jump right into it, starting with day number 1. The groups are kind of scattered all throughout the week. The group will be listed on the screen, so you know which group each team is technically a part of and, what they're fighting over in particular, and we'll talk about the groups at the end of the video, obviously, with an updated standings page. But starting off, day number 1, we've got some Group D, the big group, the 5-team group matchups here, and that's going to kick us off with perhaps the 2 worst teams in the league going head-to-head. Ultra Prime taking on Invictus Gaming, and Ultra Prime is actually going to be the team to pick up the win here to start off week number 1, to start off the summer split in the LPL. This isn't a huge surprise. If you watched my primer, a couple of things ended up going Ultra Prime's way that really helped them get over the edge. Obviously, none of these games were big blowouts. They were all relatively close. I don't think either of these teams are particularly dominant, but couple of changes going in favor of Ultra Prime when it comes to the roster decisions. First of all, Zuyan is actually in the top lane for Invictus Gaming instead of You Should Know Me. It does seem like You Should Know Me is out of Invictus Gaming, whether that is just on the bench for them or being sold to a different team. There are rumors abound that You Should Know Me is just not a part of this IG organization anymore, and that there is a chance that we are going to see him pop up somewhere else. I know teams like Thunder Talk have been floated around. There are a lot of teams that need top laners right now at the LPL level. A lot of teams that I think are going to be looking for an upgrade like that. So I wouldn't be surprised if You Should Know Me is somewhere else. But for now, Zuyan is the starting top laner. Of course, GLFS is starting in the jungle. We went over all these roster changes in the primer video. But another one that I wasn't necessarily anticipating, but I'm certainly welcoming, is Ching Tian starting in the top lane for Ultra Prime. I think this is just a straight up upgrade to Decade. I think basically anybody would be an upgrade to Decade. He has been an absolute disaster at the LPL level. Again, I understand he was really good in the LDL. I watched the tape as well, but it just didn't work at this level. He needs to go back and regain some confidence. But outside of that, I'm really not all that shocked. I said in my primer video that if Ultra Prime ended up starting Ching Tian, I'd probably have them at number 16 instead of at number 17. I think Invictus is a weaker team in terms of talent with the roster that they've ended up choosing, and I think that ended up coming into fruition here. They just couldn't win fights down the stretch of this series. Now, some things ended up going against them in terms of 50-50 luck. They end up losing that last Baron in game number 3. GLFS smites it down to I want to say 2 or 3 HP or something like that. I mean, just a ridiculous, unlucky kind of smite moment that you're not going to get in a lot of different circumstances, but those are the small decisions that end up costing you a series, and Invictus really couldn't afford to lose this. Not that they were ever really feeling like a team that was going to try and push for top 3 in this group, but this really kind of puts them in a very bad spot because it does not get easier from here. This was your easiest series. Player of the series for me is going to go to Yuakai in the mid lane. It felt like he was the most consistent throughout the series, but I think everybody definitely held up their end of the bargain. Hacker was great in game number 2. I thought that there was a lot to like. Not that Yuakai wasn't very good on the Yone. I think a lot of those ultimates were what actually set up a lot of the Karthus, plays to be able to get him snowballing, to start moving along into the game. I thought Nickit was great in his LPL debut. You know, we talked about this. Swapping out Dway for Nickit was definitely an interesting decision. I think they are relatively equal prospects. Dway obviously getting sold off to RA. If you got a good lump sum of money for him and then you could spend less to go and get Nickit, I understand where it's like, we're getting a similar style prospect and we're also making money off of it. I can understand the idea behind it. I didn't love the idea of just getting rid of Dway after one split because he was such an interesting support prospect, but Nickit was really good here in the first series. Worth noting, though, that he's going into likely the worst support in the entire league in Vampire. So not a shock to see him play well. I thought Doggo did his job. One of the concerns that Ultra Prime had last split was that Doggo just really underperformed basically in every single circumstance and every single opportunity. If he can get back on track to just being a good late game carry, not even somebody that this team relies on, I think that immediately increases the floor for Ultra Prime. Remember, Doggo at one time was considered somebody who could theoretically play for one of the upper teams in the LPL. I'm not saying that that's the same guy that's still there. There are obviously confidence and work ethic issues that have come into play for Doggo that have kept him out of that upper echelon, but he can be a starting caliber AD carry at the LPL level, and you just need him to perform his role. The only concern with Ultra Prime is that top lane was a bit of a weakness. Now, that's not really a big shock. Xingtian was down in the LDL for a reason. He's not a perfect top lane prospect, but Zuyan was actually really good in game number 1, and that Skarner really was a bit of a problem. Also worth noting, I didn't even mention it, Fearless Draft is implemented here in this first round, this qualification round, the group stage round, whatever you want to call it here for these teams. And so when you do have these power picks early on in a draft, they aren't going to be as universally usable throughout the rest of the draft. We saw teams try to move around their playstyle, but some teams are also trying to save certain picks for later on in the series. So there is some interesting dynamics that Fearless offers. It's only going to be around for this stage. It's not around for anything else after this, so I don't think it's going to impact things too much, but Zuyan looked great on the Skarner, not so great on everything else, but he really was the only positive, I would say, for IG. Everything else was a bit of a disaster. GLFS did some good things. I think generally as an aggressive jungler, he looked pretty okay. Just no consistency at all, and again, if he were to get that smite in game number 3, they probably do win the game. It's a very minor adjustment. Again, it's hard to even really blame him because, when a minion survives on 4 or 3 HP or something like that, it's really not your fault that you smited early, but it's just unfortunate that things ended up going that way. But I think when you're looking at places where IG got outplayed, support definitely comes to mind. Vampire was horrible here. Once again, he's going to get done of the series. He's just not an LPL caliber player. He proved it last split on Edward Gaming. He's proving it right now on IG. Like, this is not a player that should be in the LPL right now. This guy barely has any LDL experience. He needs to go down to a lower level and get some confidence because it just doesn't feel like he has not only the skill level, but the, mentality to play at this level yet. He doesn't really know when and where to be. He hasn't received that kind of coaching yet, and I don't think this IG team is going to help his development in that regard. I also think Nenny looked relatively outclassed throughout a majority of the series. Yuukai was just straight up better. I think there was some hope for Nenny because he's looked okay in the past in small stints in the LPL, and he was really good in the LDL. Last split, he was kind of the big, okay, let's see what he can do here, but definitely not a great debut for him or re-debut here in the mid lane. Just generally, it feels like IG is just throwing shit at the wall and seeing what sticks, and right now, none of it felt like it stuck. Zuyan, like I said, looked interesting. I think GLFS looked interesting. I think those are positive signs, but IG does look like a team that is likely going to be one of the worst, if not the single worst in the LPL. And for Ultra Prime, it's a nice win. I don't think it really matters all that much. You would have to beat at least somebody else in this group in order to try and make it out into that top 3, but at least you're not the worst team in the group. I think that that's definitely something to hold your hat on, and maybe there is upside for this team if Hacker and Yuukai can continue to play the way they did in spring, and if Nickit can actually get the most out of Doggo. I think that there is theoretical upside for Ultra Prime, but this feels like a more moral victory than anything else. And then moving on to our second series of the first day, and another Group D matchup, but this time the top of the group instead of the bottom of the group. It's Weibo Gaming taking on Ninjas in Pyjamas, and NIP actually picks up a very strong win here. I think, it was a 2-1, and they did win the final 2 games of the series, but this was a lot closer to a 3-0 than it was to a 2-1. Ninjas in Pyjamas absolutely destroyed them, and Weibo just narrowly pulling out a win in game number 1. Breathe getting a pretty miracle situation on the Skarner, and Light being able to follow up on the Aphelios ended up causing a victory in that one, but they were never in control of this series. They didn't have control of a single game in this series. They were lucky to take a game off of Ninjas in Pyjamas, and that is definitely a bit concerning, but one thing that I do want to pump the brakes on is I see a lot of people saying already that Weibo is a disaster, that it was clearly a mistake, and that Tarzan has always been overhyped, and that people were freaking out about him. It's one series. It's the first series that these guys have played together. We've seen so many teams struggle out of the gate only to figure it out a little bit onwards because they get more time to communicate and play together and figure out the structure with which they want to play. And especially for someone like Tarzan, which we'll talk about, he's very communication oriented. Like, that's always been his play style, is that he plays better with his teammates and he kind of elevates teammates. And so if you're not on the same page as your teammates, or at least if that connection isn't as strong as it could be, that could be a bit of a problem out the gate for Weibo. And I think that's kind of what we saw here. But big credit to Ninjas in Pyjamas, really bouncing off and capitalizing on their top 4 finish from spring. This was a really good, kind of performance to show and solidify that, hey, that wasn't a fluke. Hey, we really are as good as a lot of people want to make us out to believe, and we are as good as a top 4 team. Like, we are a team that should be threatening to go to Worlds, and in particular, Rookie is just ridiculous. He's player of the series. Guy has been absolutely dominant. Like, there is nothing else to say. He's been the hyper carry for NIP throughout a majority of this year. He's been an MVP caliber guy for NIP throughout the majority of this year, and it's really nice to see. Again, I know I harp on this topic a lot on this channel, but him coming back and choosing Ninjas in Pyjamas as an org and not necessarily the team that was surrounding him, signing with this org essentially before he knew any of the players that he was going to be playing with, it just showed the kind of confidence and faith in this org that he has, and also the comfortableness that he is going to have playing with this org and, playing with whoever they want to put around him. And it's really worked out so far. Rookie continues to be absolutely amazing. He gapped Xiaohu in lane throughout a majority of this series. Xiaohu has really struggled in the laning phase. It's always been a bit of a problem for him. He's never been a great laner, even in his prime, but now that his skills are kind of deteriorating elsewhere, it doesn't necessarily mean that his laning is just kind of better. Like, just because his team fighting is worse doesn't mean that his laning is better. It's just, it's not hideable anymore because he's not having those great late game pop-off moments. And so Rookie being able to take advantage of those laning phases on things like Orianna, of all things, is definitely problematic. Even Corki, he was up in gold and up in CS on Corki going into Hui, which it just should never happen. Like, that's not excusable for Xiaohu. We'll talk about that in a minute. I also want to give a big shout out to Shanji. I thought he had a pretty good series here. Game number 1 was solid in lane, and he was really good in lane throughout the majority of the series. Could have been a bit more consistent in team fights. I think that is going to be a bit of a criticism for him. He's always been very good in the 1v1s. He has been able to take over games in the mid to late game before, but that was a big issue for him in spring, and so definitely going to be interesting to see if that lasts. But Zhuo, Photic, Aki, all good. This was Rookie's series for Ninjas in Pyjamas. He was the standout player, and it wasn't particularly close. And then for Weibo on the other side, again, there's going to be a lot of people tearing this team down after the first series, and hopefully that's one of the reasons why you're here on this channel and not just looking at all the other co-streamers that are talking about Weibo Gaming, is that I try not to be reactionary. I try not to be reactive on this channel. I want to try and give you the analysis that I think will age the best. And right now, maybe Weibo is bad. Like, maybe Weibo does underperform and really kind of shoot themselves in the foot, and they're worse than they were in spring. And maybe all of that does end up happening by the end of the year. It's just way too early after one series to definitively say that that is going to happen. It didn't look good here, and there were certainly some things that needed to be cleaned up, but they also showed some resilience, especially in that game 1. See a lot of people dogging on Breathe. Breathe was the only reason they won that first game on the Skarner. That champion is just ridiculous. Light and Crisp were also generally fine. Light in particular, I think, had a pretty good series, but mid-jungle just kind of let them down. Xiaohu or Tarzan could be dead of the series here. I'm going to give it to Tarzan. Just not a great debut series for him. There were just a couple of moments where it didn't feel particularly good. His lack of ability to control objectives continues to be a bit of an issue. That was the problem on LNG last year, and that has carried over into this series. I think he's lost some ridiculous amount of dragons in a row. Just something like that. He needs to get better and a little bit more active on that side. He always has prioritized, whether it was Herald or whether it's now Grubs, he's always prioritized topside objectives. I just don't think that's going to be useful for Weibo throughout the entire split, but also Xiaohu needs to be able to survive in lane better. The regression is real for Xiaohu as a player. It's been pretty steady over the past couple of years, but against top mid laners, he has to at least be able to survive. Like, he was good enough at Worlds for them to be able to make World Finals, but he really has not been a massive positive for this team ever since the regular season of last year, and so I need to see something out of these two. It was not a great start for mid-jungle, but everything else I think you can clean up. And again, it's just too early to make definitive statements around Weibo for me, but this is a really big win for Ninjas in Pyjamas. Hopefully they can continue on that top 4 trend that they showed last split. I don't know how realistic that is going to be. There are a lot of teams that are going to be vying and fighting for that, but this win kind of shows that they at least deserve to be in the conversation. But then moving on now to day number 2, and we move over to Group B, and kicking off Group B, the first matchup here of the group stage, it's Team WE taking on RNG. And WE pretty predictably is able to get that 2-0 series win. They should be the better of these two teams. I know there was a ridiculous amount of hype for RNG coming out of like this offseason because they did go and make some changes. Fong is in at 80 carries, ADZ is now in the top lane. You're hoping you can get better performances out of Ming. People are holding on to the fact that Wei might still be what he was 2 years ago, but the truth is that I just don't think this is a playoff team. Basically, under any circumstance, as you can see, I have them as my number 12 team in my power rankings, and they performed like that in this series. WE still has way too many positives for me to consider them underdogs by any means to get out of this group in the upper stage, and that's exactly what they showed in this series. Player of the series could go really any of the solo laner directions. Like Wayward and Fofo continue to be the heart and soul, like the lifeblood of WE, the win condition, quote-unquote, of WE, and I think that very much continued here. It's what they were in spring. Wayward and Fofo were the stars, and I think that definitely followed up here at the start of summer, and I think you could give it to either of them. Wayward was definitely more impactful because of Skarner in game number 1, because that champion can just do whatever he wants. He can CC 3 people and pull them into the team. It's just unfair. It's like not easy to try and play into, but Fofo was probably a bit better in terms of execution, so he's going to get that player of the series for me. Mid lane was a ginormous gap, and we'll talk about that when we get to the RNG side, but Fofo's a big reason for that. This guy continues to be underrated by a majority of the LPL community. I never really see him talked about on the same level as some of the other like upper tier mid laners in the LPL, and I think that that's absolutely the case. He is right there, you know, competing for top 5, top 6 mid lane in the LPL. I think that that's a very reasonable thing to say, and he just performs well. For the most part, he's super consistent. A lot of the things he gets criticized for aren't particularly like real parts of his game. Like they'll show up every once in a while, but they're not things that you have to be worried about on a game-to-game basis. I just think Fofo is really solid, and I think he showed that off here. But Wayward continuing to be a big problem for teams to try to deal with. If you do not have the skill to go toe-to-toe with Wayward on the top side of the map, you are just going to get absolutely destroyed. It is a bit of a like skill check on the top side, if you will. It's why he was so dominant for a lot of the spring split, why he was an MVP candidate for a lot of the spring split. It's because when he goes up against players that are just not as talented as he is, he just utterly destroys them. And we saw that on top esports too. People just like to forget that because he was weak side so many different games, but getting more of an opportunity to actually take 1v1s and play more aggressive here has really opened up Wayward to become one of the scarier top laners in the entire league to face, in my opinion. Hang was solid. Mark was really good. That's something that we're going to have to monitor, right? He has been fine, generally speaking. His worst stop was definitely this past spring on LNG, but I always defended him a bit on top esports. I thought he was better than he got credit for on that team, and I think there is an opportunity for him to be okay here. I still think he is like a middle tier, like an average LPL support. I think that that is certainly doable. He was more than that in this game, even with his bot laner kind of running and trolling a bit, and that's the other thing we'll talk about. LP was the player I was most concerned about for WE. Honestly, he is the reason WE comes in so low. Him and Hang, who I just don't have a ton of confidence in, are players that I do not think are going to be able to make it at a top level, and LP certainly did nothing to dissuade that in this series. In lane in particular, he was just completely gapped by Fong in both games. He played Lucian and Kalista into Varus and Ashe, and he lost lane hard in both games, and that's just never a good sign. LP has been nothing but a disappointment at the LPL level. Maybe you can look at that one LNG split and be like, I can see some of the positives there, but I mean, you're really grasping at straws. He was the reason that team lost in the playoffs, and he was horrible for RNG. I'm not shocked to see him really underperform in this first series, but again, if the solo laners are going to be able to win, it should be good enough for WE to at least do something here. But for RNG on the other side, their problems have not changed. Like, I think a lot of people were just assuming that things were going to get better for this team going into summer because, I don't know, it wasn't spring and they made some changes, but I think they got worse on paper, or at least in some areas, I think they got worse. I think top lane is definitely a downgrade, and that was shown off here. ZDZ, horrendous into Wayward, was never even remotely on the same level as Wayward in this series, and that's a bit of a concern. But Tong Yuan, man, there's just nothing else to say. This guy is arguably the worst mid laner in the LPL right now, and they keep giving him chance after chance after chance, opportunity after opportunity, but he does nothing. This Tristana game in game 2 was horrible. I mean, truly one of the worst games that we've seen out of him, and he's already been pretty bad. His best split was the split he was splitting time with Angel, his first ever split in spring of 2023. Ever since then, it's just been downhill after downhill, and things have just not been working out for him. He was mega gapped by Fofo in these games, and that's not really something I'm expecting to turn around. And even if you do have Huanfeng and Ming looking better, Huanfeng in particular definitely looks like an upgrade to LWX, who was, unequivocally a disaster last split. I don't think there's enough talent on this team to make that better. Ming was still just kind of an average support, and I still don't know if he's in meta right now. Like, I don't know if he feels comfortable with a lot of the current meta supports. And then Wei is a player that continues to be a bit overhyped by the community. He relies a lot on his laners getting ahead, and they're not getting ahead right now. ZDZ is a downgrade. This is not a good RNG team, and I don't think they should be favored to get out of this group in the upper bracket, especially after this loss to WE. I think that definitely puts a damper on their expectations. This is a team that I think will continue to struggle. I don't think that the changes were enough to really rewrite their fortunes. But for WE, nice win. Glad to see this team come out and start strong. I think Fofo and Wayward continue to be the core, kind of the carries of the team. If LP can just survive on the bot side of the map, if he can just be okay enough, I think WE could actually be a team that competes. That is a big ask, though, because right now it feels like LP is in like the bottom 5 of 80 carries at the LPL level, but there is enough positives on this team for me to believe this team should at the very least be pretty close to locked in for playoffs. And then moving on to our second series here of day number 2, and it's one of the finalists getting their first taste of summer action. It's Rare Atom taking on Top Esports here in Group C, and Top Esports pretty cleanly gets that 2-0 done. I mean, they absolutely dominated Rare Atom. I know some people had expectations for this team, me included. I do think they will be better moving into summer, but Top Esports is a bit too much of a challenge for them. It's just not a particularly fair matchup on a lane-to-lane basis. Nobody was really able to survive in terms of the 1v1 matchups, and they ended up kind of getting cooked for it. So credit to TES. They looked excellent here. I'm probably not going to spend too much time on this one because it was kind of a shellacking. Player of the series is going to go to Cream for me in the mid lane. Was really good. Cream continues to improve and evolve. He's really not been a resource getter for TES over the course of this year, which is kind of surprising because Cream has always been known as a bit more of a resource heavy mid laner, somebody who does prefer those assassins, things, like the Akali, like the LeBlanc. That's always kind of been his specialty, but taking that more utility, team-oriented role going into TES this year is, I think, what really elevated the rest of this team to do the things they've been able to do. Now that I think we're going back to kind of a mid-lane carry meta, I think it's nice to see Cream still comfortable pulling out some carry-oriented picks, although not even the assassins. The Hui, and specifically the Corki in this series were really strong. Worth noting, Corki mid, something that we see a lot of in the LPL this week. I'm not sure if we're ever going to see that flexed out elsewhere. We've seen it, be buffed in the AD carry role, especially after the changes, and so I would imagine that at some point we're going to see it transition there, but I think a lot of teams are still a lot more comfortable playing it through a solo lane. Cream still looking really good on it, even if I think the champion is very bad in the mid lane right now. But Tian was the other player that I was really considering for player of the series here. That Talia, exceptional in game number 2. I mean, he truly was fantastic. Tian has been great throughout all of this year. Really, he has not had a horrible performance yet. I know some people are waiting for the shoe to drop when it comes to Tian, but he has just been really good for Top Esports, especially domestically. Mako continues to look awesome on these tankier picks. It's him getting back to comfort as opposed to what he was doing on Edward Gaming last year, having to play with Uzi and having to kind of change up his playstyle to be more of an enchanter player to allow the AD carry to be a bit more, I don't know, aggressive. Like, Jackie Love is more than willing to play Ziggs and Senna and to be this more, I don't want to say passive, but like, late game aggressive kind of carry, because it's not like he's playing Senna passively. He's playing Senna like a frontline bruiser, but it allows Mako to be a little bit more aggressive in terms of his roams, and I think that's always getting Mako back. It's always good getting Mako back to what he's comfortable on, and that's what he's comfortable on. 369 was the better top laner. He played Mordekaiser in game number 1, which is crazy as an answer to Skarner, but overall, Top Esports just looking really good. I think some people were expecting maybe an MSI hangover, but I wasn't. I thought this team was going to roll this group. They've had plenty of time to get back to the LPL in practice, and that's kind of what I expected to see here, was a dominant performance. And then for Rare Atom, some of the changes just didn't necessarily work here to start off the summer split. Jue in particular looking really poor. He's going to get done of the series. There are some people saying that Jue is a major downgrade to Rare Atom. Those people didn't watch Rare Atom last split. There's simply no freaking way that you can watch Rare Atom's support situation last split and say that Jue is a downgrade, even as poorly as he played here. Zora was horrible for this team and just didn't really offer anything. Getting Jue, who at least has upside and was okay for Ultra Prime last split, is something for this team. Again, I like Jue as a player, but this was not a great introduction. New players, I want to give some grace and some time, especially going up against Top Esports. I'm not going to judge him too early. Everybody else lost, though. Xiaoshu was not good on the top side going into 369. Zhao Hao did not look good in his kind of debut performance, going back to kind of this lower bracket style run for him, not necessarily getting the time he needed to develop there on Weibo Gaming. And then Vikla just wasn't nearly as good as Cream, was getting destroyed in lane even on the Yone, which is never a good sign. Rare Adam was just outclassed. Again, not really a lot to talk about. This is a bottom tier team going up against one of the best teams in the entire world. I'm not shocked to see this go the way that it did. So credit to Top Esports. They looked really good and they kicked off their group stage, their Group C stage here with a really strong win. Moving on now to day number 3, though, but sticking with that Group C trend, we've got the other 2 teams in the group going head-to-head. It's OMG taking on LNG Esports, and LNG is going to pick up the 2-0 win. Very dominant fashion, very good look from LNG. One of the things that I am most surprised about is that they actually didn't make any changes here going into summer. We all thought Shadow was going to be starting in the jungle, that they picked him up in the offseason. It felt like all of the content surrounding that was that Shadow would be their starting jungler. For now, it seems Weiwei still has that job. I don't necessarily think that's the worst decision in the world. Weiwei is certainly a playable jungler. Like, he is a good jungler at the LPL level. I just worry a bit about the fit between Weiwei and Scout. That was always a bit of the concern, was that these two, like, they just have, we'll just say, conflicting playstyles. I think that's a pretty accurate way to describe it. And so I was worried about that potentially being a problem for this team, but if it's the direction they want to go in, I think that that is fine. Scout certainly didn't seem to struggle in this series because of it. He's going to get player of the series. If you're keeping count, that's 5 straight mid laners getting player of the series to start off the LPL split. I wonder what lane is really strong in the meta right now and what lane kind of dictates whether or not you win the game, but I digress. Scout definitely looking a lot better here. He was going into Angel, who is a very good mid laner, somebody who is more than capable of playing at this level, and so Scout really being able to dominate lane and move around the map very aggressively, I think was a super encouraging sign. One of the things he has struggled the most at is early game aggressiveness. It's really something that he struggled at in spring, and it's the reason I think some of his play tapered off a bit, is because in 2023, when he got his back-to-back MVPs, he really was just allowed to kind of play a little bit slower and be this dominating teamfight presence and kind of mid-game skirmisher around objectives, you know, 5v5 kind of player. But as we've transitioned further along into 2024, he's had to take more of an aggressive role because of Weiwei in the jungle, and I do think it's kind of worked out for him. The LeBlanc in particular in Game 2, really fun to watch. Really good series from him. I also want to give a big shout out to the top side of the map just in general. Both Weiwei and Zika were definitely better than their opposition. Zika in particular on the Camille in game number 1. I think a lot of people are going to look at Skarner and be like, yeah, obviously he played well in Skarner in game 2. Of course he played well in this series. He got Skarner. But the Camille game was honestly more impressive to me. Very good stuff from Zika. I was worried that he wasn't going to start. There were some rumors that they wanted to play a younger player in the top lane. Zika is the right player to be playing on the top side of the map. And Weiwei was also good here. Xiao Feng definitely taking more of a feast or famine approach to some of the plays he was making on the Karthus. Weiwei kind of punishing that, getting super fed on the Graves and being able to continue on. Gall and Hong also looking good. These two are always very good as a duo. Hong maybe a little bit too aggressive in some circumstances throughout this series, was getting caught out in positions he didn't need to be caught out in, but for the most part, this was just a very good series from LNG. They were ahead for moment 1, and they kind of carried that through to the rest of the series. And for OMG, you know, some positives, some negatives. Not as talented as they were last split. Starry coming in, he's just not as good of an AD carry as Abel is. I still don't know why they made this decision, but the problems that they had last split are continuing to carry over. In particular, topside looks like it's going to continue to be a problem for them. Cube is going to get the dud of the series for me. I think some people are going to want to see Angel get this. I get it. Like, Angel wasn't very good, and trust me, I will talk about that, but Cube is just such a nothing player on the top side at this point in his career. Somebody who at one time was the quintessential weak side top laner in the LPL. Really stable as somebody who didn't need resources, who was just going to be good, not necessarily an elite player, but somebody that you could definitely win with when, you know, Rare Adam was getting 3rd or 4th, you know, in the regular season. He has not been that guy for the past 2 years. He has been on a, I would say, a steady decline, but it's been a pretty rapid decline for Cube, and at this point, I just don't know if he's an LPL caliber top laner. There are a lot of non-LPL caliber top laners starting right now, and I think Cube, unfortunately, is probably one of them. Angel also just getting outplayed by Scout. Angel is the win condition for OMG, and so if he plays poorly, if he loses his matchup, this team has absolutely no shot of being able to win games. Xiao Feng, pretty okay. Still like Xiao Feng a lot. I think as a player, I've really warmed up to him. He was a big positive surprise for me coming out of the spring split. I'm glad to see that, you know, even if there were quite a few too many deaths on the Karthus in this one, that it still was kind of worth it in terms of the damage he was able to output. And then Starry and PP God are just not going to be a particularly dominant bot lane. There were times where they were able to get some picks on Hong because he was out of position, but for the most part, I don't expect them to be anything other than an average at best bot lane. And for OMG, that probably means they're on the lower end of this group. LNG and Top Esports are definitely the two favorites, and they showed up and showed out in their first series. Not a big surprise to see LNG dominating, but it is good to see them do it in the way that they did. Then moving on to our second series of day number 3, and we're going back to Group D, our first matchup between teams that have already played this week. It's Weibo Gaming taking on Invictus Gaming, and Weibo is going to pick up the 2-1 series win. Perhaps you would have liked to see this be a 2-0 with how Invictus looked in that first series against Ultra Prime. Weibo definitely still working out the kinks. This was not a great opening week for them. I think there are going to be some people that jump on that and say, hey, look, they clearly downgraded. Tarzan is clearly a downgrade, and, Breathe is clearly a downgrade, and Xiao, who's the worst player in the universe. I think there are some reasonable concerns that we'll talk about with Weibo Gaming, but I think there's a lot to like about this team, and there were a couple of moments in this series where it was like, oh, so this is what it's all for, right? Like, it's coming together. We're figuring it out. So I think for the most part, I'm just going to give them some time and some grace to figure things out because they did look good when they looked good, but IG, credit to them. A couple of players actually played well in this series for a team that I think might be the worst in the entire league. I think that there were some positives and some upside to this series. I just don't see them being able to win a lot of best of threes, especially in Fearless Draft when a couple of their players do seem pretty reliant on a couple of champions, but let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series is Light in the bot lane. It was really up to Light or Breathe. Light and Breathe were both exceptional in this series. I think you could give it to either. Light was probably a bit better throughout all 3 games, which is why I'm giving it to him again. Consistency is something I value a lot. Light was definitely better in Game 1 on the Ezreal. He essentially won Game 1 for Weibo Gaming. He got super far ahead and was just able to snowball the game out of control. He was keeping them in it on the Kalista in Game number 2, even if he wasn't strong enough to actually be able to do anything, and he was still very valuable on the Ashe in Game number 3. I think he was the best player on the team throughout this series, which is why he's getting player of the series, and Light will always be underrated by the community. He was a big reason why this team made World Finals last year, and I get it. The Shy took a lot of headlines, and he deserved it. He was amazing at Worlds, but Light was underratedly one of the single best players at Worlds this past year, and he's been one of the best AD carries in the world for the past 2 or 3 years, ever since that final year on LNG. I would say he's been a top 5-ish AD carry in the world, and he continues to look amazing when given the opportunity. Him and Crisp have great chemistry. Crisp was also very good in this series, a lot of great engages, and generally I think if this team is going to stay consistent, a lot of that is probably going to be through bot lane, which has been their stabilizing force the past few years anyways. But Breathe was also excellent. Zuyan not nearly as strong in this second series as he was against Ultra Prime. Not that that's a huge shock, but Breathe is the reason I'm super optimistic about this team. Even if you want to sit here and say that Jungle Mid has major problems, and they do. Jungle Mid has some major problems in terms of communication and whether or not they're going to be a strength for this team. Breathe is such an upgrade in the top lane that I don't think it will necessarily matter. He just does things that ZDZ was never going to be able to do. Honestly, he is a more consistent version of the Shy. Like, there are going to be moments where the Shy is better than Breathe, but throughout a regular season, especially throughout like an entire year of the LPL or half a year in the LPL here, like Breathe is going to give you a better output than what the Shy offered you, and that is a massive upgrade to a Weibo Gaming team that's not really had consistent topside pressure outside of Worlds in a long time. Like, they've just not had that. But there are concerns. Tarzan and Xiao, who are not on the same page. I think Tarzan's hate is way out of control. I think, again, it's really funny how LPL fans just like to scapegoat certain players. I'm sure if Karsa came back, he would also be scapegoated in the same way, no matter how he played. Tarzan is one of those players that is just always going to get blamed for things that aren't necessarily his fault. There are things he can improve upon, but I see him getting blamed for Game 3. He was awesome in Game 3 on the Sejuani, constantly setting up things for the rest of his team to be able to capitalize on, specifically for Breathe to be able to capitalize on. Yes, he gave up resources. Was he always in perfect positions? No, but neither are your other favorite junglers that you constantly like to talk about on Reddit. So, like, I don't really understand where the Tarzan hate in Game 3 came from. He wasn't perfect the rest of this series, but he showed up when it mattered the most. I think Xiaohu was worse than Tarzan in this series. I think that was a pretty easy call for me. There were moments where he just was not playing well. I'm very concerned about Xiaohu. This has not been a strong start to the split for them. And they don't seem to be on the same page. Mid-jungle don't seem to be on the same page. And I think that's more concerning for me than like whatever imaginary problem like Tarzan has with the rest of Reddit. So for Weibo, I think they'll be just fine. Bot lane is too good and top lane is too good for this team to be bad. But if they want to be a Worlds team, mid-jungle simply has to tighten up and they have to get a bit more consistent. But for IG, that's where they were able to attack. Nenny had a great series here against Weibo. And I think that that is definitely going to be the thing that you're looking at as a positive. Hopefully Nenny can continue to grow and be a good mid laner. This team has put a lot of time and effort into developing him. He's been in this org for like 3 or 4 years at this point, as a top laner, as a mid laner, just throughout kind of the system. And so to see him get an opportunity here in the mid lane, he didn't look great in that first series, but he looked really good here in the second one. Was probably the better mid laner out of these two, at least in terms of individual performances, which is not what you would expect, but hopefully he can continue to grow. The problem is there's just not a lot else on this team. Vampire is horrible. Once again, dud of the series. There's just nothing else to say at this point. This guy is not good enough to be in the LPL. Like, I hate taking such a hard stance against a player. Typically speaking, when I'm low or negative on a player, I will try and take a little bit more of a cautious stance on that because, you know, all these guys are trying their best, but Vampire should not have an LPL spot, and it's not his fault. He was thrust into a position way too early on into his career, and he is just not ready for it, and he's losing games for IG by himself. This was awful, awful stuff from him, and he has been horrible throughout the entirety of this year. Zuyan also took a step back. I don't think GLFS was necessarily as good as he needed to be throughout this series, and then even if On and Nenny are generally fine, like, it's just not enough. IG doesn't have enough talent across the board to survive, you know, 3 of their 5 players underperforming at any given time, and so, yeah, they lost this. They won a game, which is good, and I think generally they're going to look at this as a positive, but Weibo, if they can tighten up, again, if they can just clean up some of the mistakes, there's so much to like here for them. There are problems, like mid-jungle is not on the same page, but top bot lane, I feel so confident that they are going to be strong, that this team is still going to be a contender for a top 4 spot, even with things going wrong. Then moving on now to day number 4, I would say the middle of the week, because typically speaking, day 4 is kind of like the middle, but there's 8 days in week number 1. However, that's possible. I guess that's more than a week, but it is what it is. And kicking off day number 4 is a Group D matchup between Anyone's Legend and Ultra Prime that AL is going to pick up a win in. This is definitely a different look Anyone's Legend than we had in Spring Split. They've only made one change. It's Ale coming into the top lane instead of Harry, but it's such a huge upgrade, and it really changes the idea of how this team might want to play the game that I think it is worth it to call this like a new look Anyone's Legend, because I think the way that they're going to play is going to be entirely different, as I talked about in my primer video, and I do think the floor of this team goes up by a lot, and certainly the ceiling of this team goes up by a lot, and we kind of saw that here in the first series. Yes, it's Ultra Prime. I'm not going to freak out and say like, whoa, AL ended up beating Ultra Prime. You know, that means AL's the best team in the world because Ultra Prime beat Invictus Gaming, but, you know, AL was really good in this one, and they did what they were supposed to do. Basically, everybody stepped up and played their role, especially in game number 1, but a lot of the credit does have to go to their new acquisition, Ale, in the top lane, who's going to get my player of the series. Awesome Rumble game in game 1. You know, I don't really know what was going on for Ultra Prime. I get that Darius is a bit of a Chingtian special, like he's really comfortable on that champion, but you can't really play Darius into Rumble. Like, you can't just take Darius and hope that things go well for your team. That's not how this ends up going. Ale punished that super hard and really was able to catapult that into a game 1 stomp. And then game 2, the Jax was also very valuable. The Gragas was a bit safer from Chingtian. We will talk about him when we get over to the Ultra Prime side, but Ale was very good here at the start of this year for AL. And if he's going to continue to be like a threat, like a true threat on the top side of the map, which he should be, that's the expectation for Ale, then I think this team is going to have a lot easier of a time playing through a lot of their other players, specifically Shanks, who has been really good for this team for the most part. I talked about this in the primer, was so good for like the first 2/3 of Spring, a true like all-pro candidate through the first 2/3, and then the last third of the split, he was horrible. Like, he was one of the worst mid laners in the entire league throughout that last 1/3 of the split, but, you know, you have to hope that that's just like, oh, you know, he started to check out when this team started to lose. You have to hope that that ends up being the case, and you have to hope he can get back on track. This was a very good start here going into Yuakai, who he just kind of abused through a lot of this series. Yuakai was horrible, but Shanks was a big reason for that. He was a lot better, especially in that second game on the Jace. Krako was pretty good here. You know, Karthus is going to be a pretty highly prioritized thing throughout a lot of this split, or at least on this patch. He's going to be pretty highly prioritized on 14.10, but he was really good here. Hope and Kale, really solid. Hope plays Kai'Sa more aggressively than I've seen almost any AD carry play Kai'Sa. It's really fun to watch, considering Hope is typically considered to be a more passive AD carry in terms of how he plays the game. That completely turns around when he gets that champion, and it's pretty fun. I like Kale. Big fan of Kale. He was pretty good in this series, but AL is just a really fun team to watch. I'm not going to write home about them already. I'm not going to say that they're going to be a Worlds team right now, but it's certainly possible for them, and I think this was a good step in the right direction. And then for Ultra Prime, you know, you lost. Like, you were probably supposed to be losing a lot of these games. You're supposed to be one of the worst teams in the league, but maybe you would have liked to see a few more positives. Maybe that is, maybe would have felt a bit more comfortable here. A lot of this team ended up playing really bad here. Chingtian is a pretty easy choice for dead of the series. I think Yuakai would be really the only other option that you would even consider for this. Chingtian was just awful. Again, the Darius in game number 1 is completely inexcusable. It's just a draft, you know, disaster class. There's really nothing else to say. And the Gragas was better in terms of composition, but he just got destroyed by Ale in this matchup, and he has been really poor to start off for Ultra Prime. Even in their first series, which they won, he was a bit of a problem for them. So that's going to be something to monitor. Top lane has been a disaster for Ultra Prime throughout this year, and it does not seem like that position has gotten fixed yet. And then Yuakai was also also really bad, was really good in the first series. You know, Yuikai's just a bit of an aggressive player now. A bit of the concern was that he got in trouble for not being aggressive enough in this series. Maybe you could have stepped on the gas a little bit more. He could have been a little bit more active, and instead he just kind of let Hacker die in a lot of circumstances. He let Nickit die, who was making really good engages and wasn't following up on a lot of these aggressive plays that the rest of his team was making. You just want to see more decisive decision-making coming in from the middle of this map. Doggo's score looks better than he played. I think Hacker's score looks worse than he played. I think generally this team was fine outside of the solo lanes who got outplayed. Nickit looks really good, and I think he's going to be somebody to really monitor for Ultra Prime. He might even be an upgrade to Jue, a more interesting prospect. This might have been a 2000 IQ play where they actually just were like, we can get Nickit, who's like a star. But for now, Ultra Prime is Ultra Prime. They're probably going to be competitive against some of the worst teams in the league. They've got enough talent to do so, but I doubt this team is going to expect to compete to get out of this group in the upper bracket. But for AL, pretty good first series. I mean, again, it's Ultra Prime. It's really hard to get a ton of takeaways, but everybody looked relatively good. If you can prevent some of those horrible plays that they made around 20 minutes randomly throughout a lot of the spring split, I think this team will be a lot better. And I think the addition of Ale is obviously just generally a positive for them overall. Really good start to the year for them. And then moving on to our second series of day number 4, and it's our first time venturing into Group A. We finally get to kick off this group with a matchup between ThunderTalk Gaming and FunPlus Phoenix. And FPX is going to be able to pick up the 2-1 series win. ThunderTalk taking that first game off the back of UCal, doing really well on the LeBlanc and having quite a bit of pressure, but as this series continued to go along, the difference, we'll say, in the bot lane, the bot diff, if you will, became more and more apparent, and FPX just kind of ran away with the series because of that. I do want to give a lot of credit to Dectum and Life because they are the driving force of why FPX was able to win this series, but it wasn't just them. We're not going to try and sit here and say that it was just a bot diff and that was the only thing that got FPX across the finish line. I've honestly seen quite a bit of criticism for some of the other players on this team in terms of this series, and I don't necessarily agree with that. I think games 2 and 3 were really positive for FPX overall and gave me a lot of confidence that they are going to be a team that does get out of this group in the top 2. I think they're one of the teams that is the most on the bubble in terms of being pushed out of that if they don't end up performing, but let's go ahead and talk about it. Player of the series is, for me, going to go to Dectum. It was really hard for me to give it to anybody else. It was either Dectum or Life. Bot gap was the biggest problem for ThunderTalk in this series, and so it did have to go to somebody on the side of FPX's bot lane. I'm going to give it to Dectum for that Ashe game. He still was very good on the Jhin in game number 2 as well. I think he was probably the most consistent across both, but I understand why Life's Blitzcrank game in game number 2 in particular is definitely going to stand out in a lot of people's minds. I just think Dectum was more relevant throughout the majority of this series, and the fact that we have to discuss which one of these two is going to get player of the series and which one of these two is doing a better job right now, I think is a really encouraging sign, because I think people were just concerned about these two going into the year. When you're talking about, you know, FPX preseason analysis, it was, can Dectum bounce back after being benched by a horrible DRX team last year, in Life coming off of the worst year of his career on Hanwha Life Esports? Can these two rebound and be really good? Both of them were very good. Life in particular in the spring split was an all-pro caliber support. Dectum was still very good as an AD carry, and both of them seem to have carried that over here into summer. That's all you can really ask for. 1xN and Chocho are not exactly the most dominant bot lane in the world, but Dectum and Life being able to come out and just kind of win that matchup, it's super impressive. Dectum could not miss an arrow in that game number 3. I also do want to give a shout out to Care. The scoreline looks amazing, and I think some people are going to look at that and say that he completely smurfed. I've seen some people say that, oh, he's just super boosted, like the number is way too high, and if you clearly watch, he was actually inting this series. Both of those things are wrong. I think it's somewhere in the middle, as it usually is with LPL discourse. This ends up falling somewhere closer to the middle. He was generally very good throughout a majority of this series. I do think that his scoreline looks better than he played because he was set up for a lot of really good opportunities on the Corki, on the Tristana. Not necessarily the most proactive series from him, but he did take advantage of his opportunities very well, and quite frankly, he was just straight up better than UCal for a majority of the second half of this series, which is huge because UCal is such an important figure for ThunderTalk and such a good player, in my opinion. Xiao Lahu and Milky Way still kind of doing their thing. Xiao Lahu looking good. All things considered, I don't think it was a bad series for him, but he's going into Hoya, who is awful, potentially getting replaced here. And then Milky Way, not a dominant, like, carry-oriented series, which I think is what we kind of got used to for FPX. That was kind of their win condition for a majority of spring. If they can branch out and be able to win through bot or be able to win through mid and allow Milky Way to play a little bit more of a, like, supportive secondary carry role, like a secondary damage dealer. It's not like he's playing Sejuani, but, you know, if he can play Lilia and not have to do all of the damage in all of these games, I think that's just going to be a positive for them overall. So FPX looking pretty pretty good. ThunderTalk kind of being as bad as anticipated. I did not have a lot of confidence in this team going into this split. I ranked them 14th in terms of my power rankings. That would be the lowest they finished as this group of 5, or even with this core of Hoya, Beishwan, UCal, and 1XM. And I do continue to believe that it's going to be a struggle for this team this split. Chocho's going to get done of the series. This was a super easy decision for me. Bot lane was mega gapped. 1XM was really not able to keep up with Dectum in terms of the playmaking and the aggressiveness that FPX showed, but Chocho was just getting caught out over and over and over again. A disaster game for him and a disaster series. The Nautilus in particular in Game 3 was horrible, but it's not like the Rel in Game 2 was significantly better. It just wasn't great, and bot lane was not looking particularly good for ThunderTalk. And then I think Hoya is the other player that you're looking at and saying, like, you were just bad in all 3 games. You even got the Skarner in game number 1. While there was some moments where that looked good, most of game 1 was LeBlanc picks and, like, getting UCal ahead and being able to snowball that out of control. And so, you know, Beishwan looked okay. I certainly don't think he was the problem. UCal looked really good in game 1 and then really bad in games 2 and 3. And so what does that end up equaling out to? I don't really know, but I don't have a lot of faith in this ThunderTalk team. This did absolutely nothing to assuage any of my fears. I certainly think a lot of the things I was concerned about came to fruition here in this first series, but FPX is an okay team. I think ThunderTalk, if they were going to be able to compete with one of the other teams in this group, it could have been FPX, but FPX looking very good in their debut here in summer. Hopefully they can just keep up this momentum, specifically this bot lane. If they're going to be as good as they were here, this is going to be a dangerous team. Then moving on now to day number 5, and we kick day 5 off with a Group B matchup between LGD Gaming and Team WE. And WE is going to pick up the 2-0 win. That's a 4-0 start for WE. That's about as good as you could ask for. I get that they haven't played the top team in the group just yet. That's going to be on the horizon for them, but this is a really good start. They have looked untouchable through their first couple of games, and honestly, they've looked super consistent. I think the parts of this team that are working really well, and honestly, the part of this team that didn't work in their first series worked really well here in the second series, so credit to LP for stepping up, but player of the series is going to go once again to Fofo in the mid lane. What a week number 1 for Fofo. He has been dominant across all 4 games that this team has played so far, and if he's going to be able to keep this up, like continue to be a top 5-ish, player in the league, like if he can be an MVP kind of guy for WE, which I know it's 2 series, I'm not trying to jump ahead of the gun, trust me, I'm the last person to do that, but it's not out of the realm of possibility for Fofo to just kind of take over a lot of these games. If he can be that guy that he was in 2021, 2022, again for this team, that's huge for WE overall, because they have really lacked a superstar. Like, that's really the only thing this team doesn't have. They're very consistent across the board, and even if I'm not a huge fan of LP or Hang, even if I think they have their own individual weaknesses, this team has more than enough talent to do something. If you can get an MVP caliber performance out of either Fofo or Wayward or somebody of that regard, I think that completely changes the outlook of what WE could theoretically be. So a great start for Fofo. Corky continues to look amazing. I think he might even look better in the bot lane once teams do inevitably end up transitioning him as a flex pick down into that role, but right now he's still looking super good as a solo laner. I think his mid game has improved so much with a lot of the changes. I think his ability to actually play the map early on is a lot stronger at the pro level at the very least, and he's still that late game hyper carry that can take over games, and generally this meta is a lot more favorable towards slow paced, like hyper scaling type of champions. Like, they are much stronger now than they were 3 months ago, and Corky definitely fits into that. I think Corky is better now than he was in the spring split, and I think that's good for players like Fofo. He was still really good on the Azir as well. Certainly didn't feel like he was useless in that role, but it was the Corky game that he is getting player of the series for. Completely destroyed and took over game number 1. But again, big shout out to LP. Really needed to see a bounce back series from him. Even in their win against RNG, it felt like he was the one that was kind of losing a bit more against, their bot lane and against Swanfong, but showing up here against Kepler, a much weaker AD carry, a much weaker bot lane than RNG has, even if RNG's bot lane is struggling, and coming out and really looking good on that is a good sign. Like, LP was a much, much better player here in their second series than he was in their first one. Mark actually looks really good on this team. We'll see how much that ends up translating and how much he can continue doing that, but so far, it's a good sign, and Hang and Wayward were also really solid. No major mistakes. Hang definitely gapped Meteor in the jungle, which is, that's the kind of thing he needs to do if WE wants to actually start to be able to compete. If Hang wants to start moving into that upper echelon of junglers, or even that, like, average tier of junglers, he needs to be able to beat these lower tier junglers on a more consistent basis, and I think he was able to do that here. So, good win for WE. They looked really dominant in this series, and LGD looked horrible. They got completely outplayed basically across the board. I definitely said in my primer that I expected a bit of a fall off from what they were in spring, which was honestly like a pretty good team. They were like the 11th or the 12th best team in the league in spring, basically for no reason other than a ton of the other teams in the league were entirely disappointing. This is more of what I expected out of the talent pool on LGD, as a team that's really going to struggle. And a lot of my concerns and problems with this team was this bot lane sucks. Like, it's one of the worst in the LPL. They have not been able to figure out an AD carry, answer, and that has continued here. Kepler is back in. It doesn't seem like they want to go with Xiaoya, even though it does absolutely seem like he is the better player. Kepler gets another opportunity here, and he gets wrecked by LP, of all people, and so he's a clear choice for dud of the series. He was awful across both of these games. The Hail of Blades ADCs have not had a great start here in the LPL, and Kepler made it look completely useless here. It's just astounding to me. Kepler continues to get jobs in the LPL based off of the 1/2 of a split he had on Thunder Talk at the LPL level in 2022. Last year in the LDL, he was horrible. Like, he was one of the worst AD carries I watched in the LDL last year. Not even at the LPL level. At the LDL level, he was really bad last year, and then he gets a shot on LGD because he was good on Thunder Talk the year before that, and he's been horrible on LGD. Like, I just don't really understand what this team and this org continues to see in him as a starter. I think Xiaoya is definitely more interesting and more intriguing as an AD carry. At least he has the opportunity to grow, even if he has also been pretty bad for this team. At least he gives you something. Kepler feels like he has no upside, and he doesn't really feel like a player that has performed all that well. But, Jin Zhao doesn't make things easier. He's not a particularly good support. If you're Jin Zhao and you're playing Camille support, I don't think you are the guy to get away with that. Like, you're not the kind of player that can get away and make that work. Haichao, Meteor, they didn't even play well. Bertle didn't even play well. These are players that have been able to salvage things for LGD. Haichao in particular has been a huge positive. I think Bertle has been a very good player for LGD over the course of this year. Meteor can have games where he can carry, especially in this meta, where carry AP junglers are a little bit more viable. Like, he's definitely more comfortable on that style. Not that he would prefer them over marksman, but you get what I'm saying. Aggressive junglers work for him, but it didn't work here for LGD. They looked lost and useless in basically every facet of the game. This was a horrible way to start off their summer split, and I'm not going to write them off completely, but I would not be shocked if this is the level that they play at for the rest of summer, as opposed to the slightly competitive version of them that we saw in spring. But for WE, you got the job done against the two teams you should have gotten the job done against. RNG, LGD, these are teams that you should be beating if you are WE. Fofo looking amazing. If LP and Mark can really hit as a bot lane, like a starting, not even a great caliber, but like an average caliber bot lane at the LPL level, if Fofo continues to keep this up, WE could be very scary. Like, there is a world in which this is a top 5 or 6 team in the LPL. I think that that's pretty realistic, so really nice start for them. And then moving on to our second series of Day 5, and it's moving back to Group A. It's a matchup between Edward Gaming and JD Gaming. The JDG is going to win 2-0, although it wasn't quite as clean as maybe you would like it to be. JDG definitely showing some of the reservation in terms of decision-making that they showed at the end of spring that really ended up costing them at the end of their playoff run, but they still have enough talent to get the job done. A couple of their players played really well in this series, and I think that's definitely worth noting, but EDG looking very disjointed. They had a couple of good mechanical moments, and I do want to give some praise in a couple of specific areas because I do think that there were positives towards this series for them, but man, mistakes, like costly mistakes that ended up costing them game 1. Like, they really should have won that game, and they didn't, and then, JDG just kind of spiraled out of control from there, so we'll talk about it. Player of the series, to me, is no-brainer going to go to Yagao. He was the most consistent member on JDG across both of these games. He continues to be a nice rock for them. He's not Knight, and I think this team is really struggling with that because at the beginning of spring, they were really trying to use him as if he was Knight, and that's just not the kind of player that Yagao is. Not to say he's even that much worse than Knight, although I do think he is, a considerable amount worse than Knight, but he has a completely different skill set. He offers something entirely different to what Knight offers. He does not need to be somebody that gets a lot of resources early in games, and your jungler, like Kanavi, can play so much more aggressive with someone like Yagao because he's always going to have shove because he is such a dominant laner. So, it is a little bit of kind of a push and pull, but Yagao finally starting to settle into a role here. This was a nice series from him. If he is going to be kind of a focal point for what this team wants to do, I think that will limit some of the other options available, but it was really nice for this series against EDG. Kanavi is going to be somebody else that a lot of people point to. That Lee Sin game in game 2 was utterly dominant, like the best game in the series by far that anybody played, but he was inting in game number 1 on Vi, so I can't really give him player of the series, but I do want to give him a big shout out for that Lee Sin game. because it really was that good, and it really was that dominant. So the Lee Sin plus Talia, that will continue to probably be something that JDG wants to go towards. It feels comfortable for both of these players. Ruler and Missing looked good. That's a good sign. They weren't like dominating, but they also weren't a problem. And honestly, they were a bit up and down in spring. I kind of got some flack for how critical I was of Ruler in the spring split, because I honestly think he was making a lot of mistakes, and there were a lot of weird positioning errors that you just didn't typically see out of a player like Ruler, but it does seem like he's returning to normalcy here in summer. I know it's one series, but he was definitely the better ADC here. Missing was also the better ADC, especially in game number 2, which we will definitely talk about. But, you know, Flandre, very aggressive. Skarner, you know, what do you want me to say? Generally speaking, it was fine for JDG overall, and they looked good. I think some people are going to freak out about how not clean this was from them, but they've never really been a particularly clean team. I think that they've always wanted to take risks. They've always wanted to take fights. Kanavi in particular, not exactly the cleanest jungler in the entire world. So to have a series where, for the most part, everything was fine and you were definitely the team that should have won it, you know, I'm not going to be too concerned about that. But for EDG, you actually had an opportunity here, I think, to do something shocking, to at least win a game off of JD Gaming. You just weren't able to take it. And like I said, a couple of pretty critical errors, critical mistakes coming in at pivotal moments that ended up costing them, none more so than the ones that Leave made. He's going to get done of the series, and I know this scoreline actually looks pretty good. He led the team in kills. He was kind of the offensive pressure for what EDG wanted to do. They were playing around him, specifically on the Kai'Sa in game number 1, but man, he let him down. Like, he was the carry of these games and was constantly putting himself out of position, was constantly overreaching to try and pick up one-for-one trades when he is the carry on the side. Like, it's just a lot of really bad mental decisions coming in from Leave. And that's something that we've seen pretty consistently. Even the last time that he played regularly, not even talking about spring split, but summer of last year, when he played the first 4 weeks of the season before all that controversy happened, Leave was still, like, not making good decisions. There is precedent to be set that Leave might not be a player that is constantly putting himself in good opportunities. And, you know, I know that Wink isn't Mako. I'm not trying to say that, you know, Mako is the only player in the world who can get the most out of Leave and that Wink sucks or anything like that, but Wink is certainly good enough in order to get, like, Leave into a good position. And for the most part, Leave let his team down. Not that Wink was perfect. I think solo kill obviously wasn't relevant at all across this entire series, although, again, scorelines for top laners look worse than maybe what they actually are. The one player who did actually play well this series, Jeje in the jungle, and that was kind of the thing we were most interested in seeing, is if we could get the good version of Jeje back. It felt like he was entirely mental boomed before his injury in the spring split, even before, like, he was out of the lineup and hurt. It felt like he was just not connected with the rest of the team. The team was bad, and it felt like it was really taken out on him mentally, and he was better here. He definitely was pressuring Kanavi and at least trying to force him into making mistakes, but there was nobody to step up and capitalize on that on the side of EDG, and that is definitely the bigger concern. So for them, they need to find someone they can play around, and if Leave is going to be that feast or famine, boom or bust kind of player, I don't know if that's necessarily a positive for EDG overall. And then for JD Gaming, it's fine. Like, you want to see this team be cleaner. You want to see them be a little bit more clinical in terms of their execution. But generally, I don't think the series was horrible for them. All things considered, Kanavi was so good in game 2 that I'm willing to overlook game number 1. And Yagao looked excellent across this entire series. And so I do feel pretty good about JDG, although maybe next time you do want to see them come out and just kind of dominate both games. And moving on now to day number 6, we move into the back third of the week, and that kicks us off with a matchup between Rare Adam and OMG. That Rare Adam is going to take 2-1. They kind of cement themselves as maybe the number 3 team in this group with a win here. OMG definitely did not want to lose this one. Obviously, double round robin means that this isn't a disaster for them. There's a potential for them to be able to make this up. But remember, OMG was a playoff team last split. I think some people might forget that because things didn't go super well for them in the playoffs, but this was a top 10 team that has just completely crumbled. It feels like they've gotten rid of every bit of their identity over the past year or so, from being a team that finished top 4 in spring of 2023 to being a team that likely will not make playoffs here in 2024. It's definitely a bit disappointing, but for Rare Adam, this is a very nice win. This is definitely an important one. You know, OMG is the team that you should be beating if you're Rare Adam in this group, or that you need to beat at the very least to keep yourself in the conversation should things go awry with any of the top teams. Of course, it's a uphill battle, to say the least, for Rare Adam to try and be one of the top 2 teams in this group, but this was a good start. Player of the series for me is going to go to Assume in the bot lane. Bit of a bot gap, I would say, throughout the entirety of this series, but Assume was definitely the most consistent player for RA across all 3 of these games. A couple of really good moments for a couple of the other players that we will talk about, but it's nice to to see Assume continue to kind of show that he is an LPL caliber ADC. I've been pretty hard on him as a player, maybe not in terms of like hating on him. I don't think I've ever hated Assume, but I think the expectations for him have always been a lot higher for others than they have been for me. I've never really thought that he was going to be a guy that was going to turn into like a superstar AD carry at this level. You saw a lot of people talking about him on LGD, or talking about him ever since Rare Atom acquired him as a player to watch out for as the next big LPL AD carry, because every single ADC that comes through the system for LPL fans is the next big LPL AD carry. We've seen it so many times, but Assume was always just a guy to me. I think that being said, he is a good just a guy. Like, he is good at the game of League of Legends. He's just never going to be a star. I think he can be a starting caliber LPL ADC, and honestly, he kind of has been a starting caliber one, if slightly below that, like a slightly below average one, but he's good enough for you to be able to win with, and I think this was a good series. He's going into what I consider to be the weakest AD carry in the league right now. Well, I guess the LGD would certainly have a word with that, but Starry is certainly in that conversation and definitely made the most of the matchup. I do want to give a big shout out to Xiao Hao as well. I thought Xiao Hao was really good across most of the games here, and I'm really hoping that he can continue to play really well. He is kind of the king of summer. If you haven't noticed over the past couple of years, he's been an all-pro on my channel in summer of 2022 and summer of 2023. That's why I was so surprised that Weibo let him go right before summer, because it's always been his better split. I still think that's definitely a possibility. You know, we'll talk about Zhao Feng across from him when we get there. He was definitely the best player on OMG in this series, but Xiao Hao was also really good. Xiao Shu was very important on the Jax towards the end of that game, just split pushing the end of game number 3, I should say. Wasn't a great combat player throughout a lot of this series, but definitely had some really good macro moments that kept his team in the game. Vikla not making errors, Dway, I think, for the most part, being a positive with those engages, even if he was caught out a couple of times more than I would have liked. Just generally a good series for RA, and one that I'm really not all that frustrated by. This was them playing really well. Games 2 and 3 felt entirely within their control, and that's a good sign. And then for OMG, not good. Like, I just think this team has lost all of its spark, all of its fight, all of the fun, like, mental, I don't know, just, like, underdog mentality that this team had in 2023. It's just all disappeared. It's all gone from this team, which is such a disappointing thing to say. There are positives. Zhao Feng was really good in this series, and I think he is continuing to be the most interesting player on OMG here in the jungle, but everybody else just not good enough. Starry's going to get dud of the series. He was the player that I thought was the least consistent for OMG across all 3 games, which is why he got dud of the series, even if he wasn't the worst in the last game or so, because Angel was horrible on the Malzahar in game number 3, but Angel was great on Hui in game number 1. So balancing that out, Starry ends up getting dud of the series, but Angel needs to be better. It's been a really poor week number 1 so far for Angel, and that's not something that OMG can survive. Again, they won basically every single one of their games last split because Angel was getting pressure in the mid lane, and it allowed Zhao Feng to be a really good mid-game jungler. If you can't do that, if Angel is not establishing that pressure and not winning in the mid lane matchup, if he's picking Malzahar and running it down in game number 3, OMG can't win games. He is too integral towards what OMG is doing for them to be able to get around that. Cube continues to be absolutely nothing on the top side of this map. PP God is not turning around, is his year. It does feel like it's a bit of a good year, bad year kind of system for PP God when it comes to like, oh, he was horrible, or he was really good on Victory 5 when they like fully emerged and were this big shocking team that almost made Worlds, and then he goes to Bilibili on the super team and underperforms. He goes back to Victory 5, looks super good, comes over to OMG, kind of ignites them, and then now here is a bad year for him. It's definitely a bit disappointing, but OMG just doesn't feel like they have the fight in them. Right now, they are clearly the worst team in Group C, and I think that's very disappointing after a top 10 finish in spring. But for Rare Atom, nice win. Again, pretty big uphill battle in order to even try to consider themselves a top 2 team in this group, but at the very least, I do think this team could be one of the teams in the lower bracket to potentially make the play-ins if everything goes right. This team is certainly talented enough, and, you know, they're interesting. They have some upside if things were to go well. So, you know, this is a nice win for Rare Atom, even if I don't think it will matter all that much in terms of the group outlook. And then moving on to our second series of day number 6, and we finally get to see the debut of our defending champions. It's RNG taking on Bilibili Gaming, and BLG does get the job done. They are going to pick up the 2-0 series win here. RNG is just in complete disarray. They are already making roster changes even after the first series, and that should go to show you just how not confident they are and their ability to win games in their current state, and they are correct in believing that, by the way. This is a welcome change, and I don't know if XZZ is the answer, but at the very least, I think it's worth giving him a shot over Tong Yuan, who at this point has proven that he is just not an LPL caliber mid laner. So we'll talk about that, but yes, XZZ is in the mid lane for RNG. No other roster changes to talk about, but Bilibili coming out with a bang. I think some people were worried about a potential MSI hangover. We've seen that in some of the other regions. You know, we haven't covered the LEC week number 1 on this channel yet, but we've seen some MSI hangover from G2 when it comes to that. You know, it's kind of a well-known thing that some teams can come back from a tournament where they go really deep and just not be as motivated in the regular season, but I never really felt like Bilibili was going to be anything other than fantastic because they're just simply too talented. They're so much better than a lot of the other teams that they're playing into that I didn't expect them to take their foot off the gas. Player of the series for me is going to go to Shun in the jungle. Really nice to see him in particular show up and show out here at the start of the regular season because, honestly, at the end of the day, he was probably this team's biggest problem at MSI and certainly was the player that I had the most question marks about on whether or not he could perform at a top level. Like, obviously, he's a top 5 jungler in the world, but can he, on any given day, perform like a top 1 jungler in the world? Can he go up against the top 1 or 2 junglers in the world and be able to hold his own? That's more of a question mark for me when it comes to Shun, and at least for now, that's definitely still going to be a question mark, but this was a really good series, and again, it shows that this team can play through him if he does play well. The Nidalee, the brand, it looked good. Obviously, Nidalee's kind of a signature champion, and he's very good at AP aggressive damage dealers like the brand. We've seen it in the past, so I'm not just going to sit here and say that my opinion has completely changed, but it's nice to see him be kind of the carry here in the first series. I do want to give a big shout out to bot lane as well, which was a really big win for Bilibili. Elk looks great, specifically on the Ashe. He can play Ziggs well. It's a little bit of a shame when he gets put on Ziggs because it's Elk and you want to see him play something more aggressive, but just as we talked about with Jackie Love earlier on in the week, it doesn't really matter what champion Elk is on. He's going to go and try and make plays. He's going to try to be aggressive on it. He's going to try to win you the game, and he was really good on the Ashe here. On was solid on his 2 engagers. Knight, just so consistent in lane. Like, it's so difficult to punish him really in any facet because of his ability to just be in the right place at the right time. He's so great at the mental part of the game, and obviously his mechanics can keep up with that. And then Bin was good as well. Maybe died a little bit too many times for my liking, but for the most part, it was just him terrorizing ZDZ in the top side and not really making it particularly close. Bilibili was better in basically every aspect of the game, and that came through pretty quickly. And then for RNG, again, this team is just kind of in disarray right now. This org is in disarray. They are not used to not being relevant at any level. Like, this is one of the worst teams in the LPL, and I think that has definitely caught them a bit off guard. I think they thought they were going to be at least semi-competitive, and they are not. They are just not competitive on any front. ZDZ is going to get done of the series. He was horrible here. I saw some people defending the ZDZ for Breathe swap on RNG side, saying like, you know, this is a lot closer than people think. Respectfully, who are you people? Like, what are we doing at that point? Breathe is one of the best top laners in the world, and ZDZ has been consistently, at best, average. Like, the player we always compared him to was Cube on Rare Atom, because at his best, he was somebody that could survive and win isolated on the top side, not necessarily needing resources to be relevant, but also wasn't like a game breaker or anything like that. He was never a star. He was never somebody that was considered a top 5 or 6 or 7 top laner in the LPL, let alone like somebody that could compete and like push this team over the top, and he's not even in his prime anymore. And so I don't really know what people were thinking. ZDZ got completely obliterated by Bin in these matchups, and he was useless outside of laning phase as well. Just a horrible series for him, and it's not like the rest of this team played better. Wei and XZZ not looking great. I mean, XZZ, I can kind of excuse it's his first ever LPL series, and he had to play against Knight. I don't know what it is about teams wanting to put their substitute mid laner in against Knight. Maybe they don't want to kill the confidence of their starter. Like, that genuinely might be it, but poor XZZ was just kind of on the chopping block, and even then, he played relatively fine in this series, all things considered. Wasn't like a strength for the team, but certainly wasn't a weakness. We've seen players play worse against Knight, and he definitely looked like an upgrade to what I would have expected Tong Yuan to look like here. Wei is just not very good. I think people are continuously hoping to hold out that he gets back on track. He's not been good for 2 years. I don't know what else to tell you. Huanfeng is mega stuck on this team. It's really funny because his former teammate Yukal was always like the king of being like in elo hell in the LPL on a team that just wasn't good enough to be able to get the most out of him. It feels like Huanfeng has come out of being benched and immediately been put in a position where he is so far and above everybody else on his team that it's just disappointing. Ming was honestly fine in this series. I don't think he played bad. There were a couple of good hooks on the Blitzcrank in game 1, but Huanfeng is just by far the best player on RNG through their first 2 series, and it just does not matter. I was a big Huanfeng fan. You know, I hyped him up a lot. Not only on Thunder Talk, I thought he was great on Thunder Talk, but even going into this split, like, I think I had him ranked as the number 6 or number 7 AD carry in the LPL. Like, going into this split, he has lived up to that so far. He's been very good. It just doesn't matter. The rest of this team is a disaster. So RNG is bad, BLG is good. Not a major shock to see that, but for RNG to be as bad as they are, I think that's a bit surprising, and it's nice to see that there is no hangover for Bilibili. Everybody looked good, but it's never really been about beating RNG. It's about beating the best teams in the world and staying consistent at the top of the standings, and that is is still to be determined for BLG. Then moving on now to day number 7, typically speaking the final day of a week, but alas, here in week 1 we have 8 days of games to cover, so our penultimate day kicks us off with JD Gaming taking on ThunderTalk Gaming. And JDG is going to pick up the win. This is another 2-0. This time, though, no questions about how clean the gameplay is. It was a pretty good performance, all things considered, for JDG. Just good stuff across the board. Everybody stepping up, everybody looking good. This was a much more well-rounded performance in terms of nobody really making these gigantic errors, and I think the players that are playing well are the players you need to see step up and be MVP candidates for this team to be what they were supposed to be, which is at minimum a top 2 team in the LPL. That's still super achievable. Hell, JDG could win the LPL if everything goes right. They have the upside to potentially be on that level, but things do have to start going right. Lucky for them, it does seem that that is the direction it is heading. ThunderTalk, not a very good team. They tried to make some adjustments heading into this series here. They swapped out Chocho for Feather, coming back into the support position. These two have traded off some time across this year already, but it doesn't really seem to have any impact. I'll talk about why it didn't really feel like this change was even really all that noticeable in this series. Both Chocho and Feather played really horrible in week number 1, but we'll get to that. For JDG, player of the series, pretty no-brainer for me is going to go to Kanavi. I think you can only debate between Kanavi because of the Nidalee game that he dominated on, or Ruler because of the Jhin game where he was doing 1 billion damage. It has to be one of those two. They were both so good in this series, but Kanavi was definitely a little bit better for me. I felt pretty confident in giving him this player of the series award. Again, that Nidalee game, pretty transcendent, pretty dominant, clearly the carry of that first game, and hell, he was kind of the carry of the second game as well. It was just Ruler was so good on the Jhin that he kind of inserted himself into that primary carry role, but they certainly didn't draft around Ruler being the carry. They drafted around Kanavi being the carry in this series, and if that's going to be the case, then I think that's probably going to be JDG's most consistent way to win games. I would love to see them be able to play around bot lane in a more aggressive way, you know, not Sivir, not Jhin, but actual hyper carries, things that are still really strong, like Jinx is still super playable in this meta, and I'm shocked to not see it all that much here in the LPL. Like, I would love to see that kind of stuff for Ruler, because I think it is really strong right now, but I mean, Kanavi is probably the best player on the team, at least in his current form, and so I have no qualms about playing for him, and especially if Ruler is going to put up carry-level performances even when he's on things like Sivir and Jhin, then it's kind of just the best of both worlds. So I understand the idea behind it, but the two best players on this team really stepping up and showing that they can still play at a monster level. This was a really good look for them. And then missing, also really good, I would say, in this series. The Leona, the Alistair, definitely the better support, and it looks like Ruler and Missing are getting back on track. They had good performances last split. I don't want to make it out like they were horrible or anything. It's just the expectation was for them to be the best bot lane in the world like they were last year, and that just very much was not the case in spring. They were top 5, or at least borderline top 5. They were in the conversation for top 5, but again, top 1 is kind of the expectation, and so far it looks pretty good for them, so that's good to see. Yagao continues to look strong, although definitely a bit more inconsistent than he was in the first series. That's only because ThunderTalk definitely put more pressure into trying to shut down Yagao. Yukal definitely played better, I think, than Cryan did in the first series, and I think that definitely helped, but Yagao definitely could have been a bit more consistent. Hoya continues to be a nightmare, and Flandre was fine, taking advantage of that. Nothing exciting. Again, I still want to see more Sheer. I will continue to die on that hill, but Flandre is fine for now. Overall, JDG, very clean week, like, except for game number 1 of that series against EDG, everything looked really good for them, so really like the direction they're heading in. And then for ThunderTalk, this is just not a very good League of Legends team. They have gotten worse every single split that this core has stuck together. It reminds me a lot of the conversation we were having around Invictus Gaming at the beginning of the spring split. Obviously, they went and blew themselves up and went in a completely different direction, and I'm worried that ThunderTalk might have to do something similar again. There are rumors that they are going out and acquiring other talent, like You Should Know Me is definitely somebody that has been linked to ThunderTalk in terms of potentially replacing Hoya on the top side of this map, and that would give them, you know, hopefully someone that they can play through and someone that they can try and win with that, you know, isn't Yukal, but right now it is Yukal versus the world. Beishwan actually has been fine at the start of this split. He's playing a lot more like he did in 2023 as opposed to how he started off 2024. 2024 spring was horrible for him. He was one of the worst players in all of the LPL, but he was, you know, kind of a pseudo channel darling before that because I really did think his macro was great and his ability to affect the map was really good. And that's kind of been fine, I would say, to start this split. He's been one of the better players for Thunder Talk through their first 2 series, but this whole team just feels disconnected. 1xN plus whoever they're playing in the support position feels like one of the worst bot lanes in the LPL right now. Feather's going to get dead of the series here. Just not a good series. The support position does not look particularly good for Thunder Talk, whether it's Chocho, whether it's Feather. That might also be a direction that they look to upgrade in, or at least that's what the rumors are circulating on right now. Poor UCal, just going to continue to be an elo hell on this team. I don't think he's perfect, but he certainly is better than his teammates around him. Beishwan trying to do something, but Hoya, the support position, it's too bad right now. Even 1xN really not performing all that well. So Thunder Talk, not a team that I'm expecting all that much out of. JDG looking good in defeating them, but it's not about beating EDG. It's not about beating Thunder Talk. We need to see JDG go up against actual real opponents. FPX feels like the closest that they're going to get to that in Group A, but with the way that they're playing right now, it feels like they're going to have a cakewalk to come out as the best team in this group. Then moving on to our second series of day number 7, and this might be the most hyped series of the week here as we get LNG Esports taking on Top Esports, and Top Esports is going to pick up the 2-0 series win, and I think we all were really looking forward to seeing whether or not LNG could keep up and whether TES's MSI hangover could be real, that they were now actually tested against a really good team, but it turns out TES is here to play. They dominated this series. They were the better team by a pretty considerable margin. They had a really good week overall, 4-0, and taking down LNG here in such convincing fashion, I think is a really good sign that we can expect a lot of the same out of Top Esports as what we got in the spring split. A team that will be competing at the very minimum for top 3, but likely for top 2. For LNG, at some point, you do have to consider, okay, we went out and made changes this offseason that we are just not currently using. And I understand why you wanted to try and stick with these 5, because it felt like things got better towards the end of the split. But let me reiterate what I said over and over and over again in my weekly reviews, and I'm sure longtime viewers of the channel are probably so tired of hearing this, but LNG had the easiest schedule of any team in the LPL over the last 3 weeks of the spring split. They had absolutely no challenge. They faced all of the bad teams, and they were able to beat all of them, and everyone got all excited that this team was figuring out their problems, that they were fixing everything, and then they ran into a Weibo Gaming team that was better than them in the playoffs, and they had absolutely no answer. Now, you're sitting here and you're holding on to those last 3 weeks and you're continuing to lose. At some point, changes have to be made, and we'll talk about that. But for Top Esports Player of the Series, for me, kind of difficult. Everybody played really well for TES, and that's a good problem to have, but I'm going to give it to Mako in the support position. Obviously, that Alistair flank at the end of game number 2 is going to catch a lot of people's eyes, but he is great on the Ornn. This really has been a signature pick for Top Esports, the Senna plus Ornn combo. Senna plus really anything over the course of this year has been unplayable for anybody else going into TES, but specifically this Ornn has become such a problem for other teams to try to deal with, because he does just give everybody else free stats. I know it's that simple, right? Like, Ornn inherently has an advantage that other champions don't have because he makes everybody else on the team better, but it really is that simple. Like, Mako is going to be useful in a lot of these circumstances. It's not like Ornn himself as a champion doesn't really accomplish all that much. I used to be really against the Senna Ornn bot lane because I felt like it just underperformed in comparison to other Senna lanes like Tahm Kench, but at least for TES, it definitely kind of feels optimal in their current setup. Jackie Love definitely benefits a lot from it, and that game 1 was great, and again, that Alistair flank in game 2, perfection. And then I really want to give a big shout out to Cream. He had an awesome week number 1, almost an underratedly phenomenal week number 1. I think he's going to get lost in the shuffle a bit because there were a lot of mid laners in particular that had really good week 1s. That position is so strong right now. If you are a good mid laner, or if your team can set you up, you're going to look amazing because that role just kind of snowballs out of control in its current state. And Cream was definitely a good example of that. Great week number 1 from him. Hopefully he can keep up these carry level performances because that kind of was missing from him in the spring. Tion was great. He was the other player that I really wanted to shout out. Big jungle gap in this series. Tion controlling tempo and just being the Tion that we know and love, being really good across the map. Jackie was good. 369 was really good. Top Esports was just better across the board. Neither of these games were entirely close. I know game 2 looks like it could have been interesting, but for the most part, it really wasn't. This was Top Esports just kind of being better in every single role, and that's a good sign for TES and a really bad sign for LNG because man, this team really wants to try to compete at the top of the standings, and they just can't in their current iteration. Dud of the series is once again going to go to Weibo. Feels like I said that so many times in spring, but I don't even think Weibo is a bad player. I want to get that across. I think Weibo is a good jungler. I think he is a good player. I think this is a miserable situation for Weibo. I think his playstyle and the way that he wants to go about the game is so opposite of the way that this team wants to operate and the way that this team wants to start playing the game that I think it hurts him and it hurts everybody else as well. His aggressive early game skirmishes, they just don't work with the rest of this team and with the way that they want to play, and I think there's just no way of fixing that. I think Shadow on the bench here feels like a no-brainer to bring in at this point, if only because it feels like he will operate within the space that LNG wants to operate on. We always talk about it on this channel. It's not always who has the most talented team. It's who has the team that can play together the best, who has the best group of 5 players, and it doesn't feel like Weibo and Scout and Gala and Hong and Zika are on the same page. They are not getting the best out of each other. They are getting the worst out of each other. That being said, you still need better performances out of players like Zika, players like Scout, players like Hong, who I think all kind of underperformed to an extent in these 2 games. They need to be able to step up and go toe-to-toe with their counterparts. Zika needs to be an upper-tier top laner. You need Scout to be that MVP level player because he is your star and you paid him as such. Gala and Hong should be one of the better bot lanes in the world, and they were not in this series. LNG just isn't clicking against the best teams in the world. It feels like they are limited towards what they can accomplish at the top of the standings, and that is just such a disappointing thing to say. I think this team can figure it out, but honestly, I think the thing that's going to be the catalyst for that is a potential roster change. For Top Esports, this was really good. Everybody looking great. All of their players domestically continuing to look like some of the best in the world, and I would expect that to continue. I think this will be a team that, looks like they should be at the top of the standings, and I would expect them to continue to be a team that competes for an LPL title. But that's going to bring us to our 8th and final day here of Week 1 action in the LPL, at least of the placements part of summer. And we kicked off day 8 with a Group D matchup between Ninjas in Pyjamas and Anyone's Legend that AL is going to pick up a win in. This is huge. I mean, truly, this is ginormous for AL. This is ginormous for the outlook of the LPL. I said in my primer that I think very sneakily AL could be a Worlds team. Well, here is their, yeah, we could be a Worlds team, type of series. I'm not saying that this is guaranteeing them a spot in top 4 or anything like that, but this is a very impressive win for them, and one that they really, really needed. There are a lot of other teams that are competing for that top 4 spot that are all kind of up and down right now. Ninjas in Pyjamas, probably clearly had that number 4 spot at least after the early parts of this week, but they lose here. You have a team like Weibo Gaming that certainly doesn't look super consistent. LNG doesn't look super consistent. AL might be on a fast track to getting in that top 4 in terms of the expectations for this team, and I certainly think they are talented enough to do so, and they proved that again in this series. I think the change in the top lane really could go a long way for them. But for NIP, this is a really disappointing series. Not only did you get destroyed here, not only was it not close, but it's against a team that you should have been motivated and fired up to go out and beat, a team that is going to try and contest you for one of those upper spots. This was not even remotely in the realm of being close. This was an absolutely dominant series for AL. They obliterated both games, and you do have to give them credit for that, but it is a bit worrying for NIP on the other side. So we'll talk about it here. Player of the series for me is going to go to Kale in the support position. I just don't know how to not give it to him. I know some people want to give it to Shanks because he absolutely massacred Rookie in the 1v1, and he did. This was a super big mid gap, but Kale was everywhere. He did everything in this series. He was so utterly dominant on both the Nautilus and the Leona in games 1 and 2 that there was just absolutely no stopping AL. He single-handedly won this series, and yes, Shanks winning helped, but Shanks could have gotten absolutely brutalized in the mid lane, and I still think with how well Kale played that this was an easy win for AL. That's how much of a difference I think his plays ended up making. He was exceptional in this one, and anybody who's followed the channel knows I'm a huge fan of his. I've been a huge fan of his ever since he got full playing time for Sandbox over in the LCK, but for him to go over here to the LPL and really reemerge as one of the better supports in the world, I think that that's a super realistic outcome for him. There's nothing stopping him from being a top 5 support in the world. There is literally nothing stopping him. His mechanics are there. His macro is there. He's got everything. He's apparently a huge shot caller. This is just an elite player, and I think at some point, hopefully, he can gain that consistency consistency to really throw himself into that conversation like he was doing in a lot of 2022 conversations. But Shanks was excellent. Rookie has been an MVP caliber player over the year so far, and Shanks absolutely destroyed him 1v1. Again, if this is the Shanks that we're getting, which is super realistic, he was an MVP guy himself through the first 2/3 of the spring split. If you're going to get that version of him for an entire year, that is an MVP player. Like, that's a top 5 player in the LPL. He can be that. He's got that kind of upside. He's always had that kind of upside. He finally has a team around him that I think can get the most out of him, and that could be the big difference maker for Shanks. Kroko was excellent in this series. I know he's very inconsistent, but remember, that inconsistency tag has come from 2023 and beyond. It's come from the DRX run and then spring here on AL, where he has been inconsistent in those runs. But go back to his time on Sandbox when he was playing with Kale. He was super consistent. He was the 2021 Rookie of the Year in the LCK. He was awesome in 2022. He was great from a game-to-game basis. That inconsistency problem has really been a recent thing for him, and so you're kind of hoping that maybe he can shed that. I think it's realistic to say that that's possible. I don't think 1 week of good action is going to give me that confidence, but it's in there. Like, he can be good on a week-to-week basis. Hope was solid here. Ale was good. AL is legit. There's nothing else for me to say. Maybe they end up, not being as good as I think they are right now. Maybe other teams end up catching up to where they're at right now, but right now, at the very least, I think there's a real argument to be made that this team is top 4. And then for NIP, this is a bad loss. Like, you wanted to at least be remotely in this conversation, but man, the players that had really kind of pushed you over the top in spring were horrible in this one. Rookie is an easy choice for dud of the series, got wrecked in the mid lane. I mean, was never even on the same planet as Shanks in terms of the 1v1. Truly a disastrous series. I think Rookie will bounce back, but man, he had some series like this on Top Esports as well in 2023. You're hoping that he kind of got this out of his system now and it doesn't pop up too much more over the course of summer. Fodek and Juo were also just horrible in comparison to Hope and Kale across these 2 games. That's something I'm a little bit more worried about. The spring split felt like an emergence for Fodek and for Juo for me. Finally a split where both of them were doing well individually and not being gifted a lot of advantages from the rest of the team. Hopefully that sticks. Again, that was kind of the, maybe they aren't as bad as I thought they were, and now it really has not been a great start to summer if this is what they're going to show. Aki and Shanji were generally fine in comparison to the rest of the team, but it's not like they were better than their counterparts. Aki, not nearly as good as Kroko. Shanji was fine, honestly. He really didn't have any major problems this series, but if Rookie and Fodek are both losing, this team can't win games. They're certainly not going to be top 4, and they're certainly not going to be able to compete with other teams around this standing. They rely on those 2 to be kind of the primary carries for this team, and it didn't happen here. AL just suffocated everything out of them. A dominant performance, a dominant week for AL, a 4-0 start for them. This is looking really, really good, and I would really like to see this org after year after year after year of disappointment with good rosters. I'd love to see this one be the one that actually sticks for them. And that's going to bring us to our final series of the week here in LPL Summer Placements week number 1, and it's certainly an upset. It is Ultra Prime taking on Weibo Gaming, and Ultra Prime is going to pick up the 2-1 series win. I don't really know how to diagnose this. I don't really even know what the problem is, because honestly, watching Weibo Gaming, like, I knew that there were going to be some growing pains going into the split. I said as much in the primer, and honestly, I'm fine with them just being a major disappointment. Like, that is something that I definitely considered. Talked about it in the primer. I talked about how, my concern with this team is that there's no real hyper carry here, right? Like, everybody here is a quote-unquote low resource player. Zhao, who traditionally has been a high resource player, but not in recent years. Breathe, not somebody who has always gotten resources. Tarzan, certainly not a carry player. Light and Crisp, certainly not like a high resource bot lane. And so where exactly are the resources going to go? That was my concern, but that is not the problem. The problem is that where the resources are going is nowhere. They're not able to generate them. They're not doing a good job of being able to get them in the first place, which I didn't think was going to be a problem for this team. We'll talk about where I think things are going wrong, why I think fans are misdiagnosing the issue. No offense, LPL fans, but this is just kind of a general trend with LPL, is people misdiagnosing what the problem is for a team, and why Ultra Prime is actually kind of an interesting team right now, and why they're doing a lot of things that I actually really like. Because they are doing all those things. All of that is real. Ultra Prime is playing like a legit playoff team right now. It's not just them beating teams that are struggling. They're doing a lot of good things. Hacker is going to get player of the series here. I actually think this was a tough decision, and that being the case with Ultra Prime's win over Weibo, the fact that it wasn't one or two players that were really stepping up and just dominating, that everybody on the team kind of looked good and that they felt like they had a pretty clear and concise game plan, like, it's just such a positive factor for me, and Hacker continues to look really solid. He was pretty good in spring, all things considered, and honestly, Hacker's been good before. I know a lot of people like to forget about the E-Star days, but that E-Star team from like 2020 was actually kind of interesting to watch, and Hacker was a big reason for that. There's a reason I've been hanging on to Hacker for the last couple of years, and it's been, even though he has struggled at times, he'll have games every once in a while where he looks pretty darn good. He's just not been able to put it together for an entire split. He's been pretty good in 2024. This has been one of his best years in a long time, and this was a great showcase of why. His ability to control the game on things like Brand and Karthus, it's just a high level of macro. Like, that is something that he's always been really good at, and it's continued to come out here. Doggo was also excellent. A lot of people are going to look at that Draven game and say that he should be player of the series, and I agree. Like, the Doggo was great here. This is one of the better series that he has played in, I don't know, his entire tenure. In the LPL, it's certainly up there, but I think it would have been a little bit more difficult without Hacker kind of enabling a lot of that. His tempo in the jungle was excellent, but Doggo was great. Nickit continues to look like a phenomenal pickup for Ultra Prime. They played 3 series this week. Nickit looked like the better support in almost all of their games. Like, it was truly exceptional just how well he played. They could have found a secret star here in the support position. Yuakai kind of getting back to basics, being more aggressive, getting on things that he can push tempo in the mid lane on, especially into someone like Xiaohu. That's a big matchup advantage for them, and Xing Tian playing by far the best series he had all week. He was a bit of a weakness in their other 2 series. He was pretty good here, even going into Breathe, and so Ultra Prime just generally looking solid. A great control of the map, a great understanding of what to do once they generate positive resources. Like, this could be a legit team. Like, this is more than a lot of the other teams in the LPL are showing right now. Spoiler alert, they're going to skyrocket a bit in these power rankings. They look really good right now. And then for Weibo, again, there are issues, and there are a lot of issues. I see a lot of people just saying, oh, it's because Tarzan joined. And you know, I hate calling out fans because it really makes me feel like I'm jaded, and I don't want to alienate anybody who watches these videos. I don't want anybody to sit there and be like, well, why is he yelling at me, right? But it just feels so lazy to say, oh, it's Tarzan's fault. Like, I don't know. I get it. Tarzan's making mistakes. I'm not going to sit here and try and defend him, but if the analysis is, oh, it's Tarzan's fault, if we replaced Tarzan with somebody else, then we would do better, then you're kidding yourself. You are lying to yourself, and that's the kind of mentality that's gotten teams in these ridiculous stretches where they just can't seem to find answers. It's because they're scapegoating the wrong thing. They are identifying the wrong problem and making solutions to areas that aren't correct, and I think Weibo is in danger of kind of falling into that. There are much bigger issues than Tarzan on this team right now. Tarzan's a part of the issue, but playstyle is an issue for this team. They are really slow, and that was going to be a bit of a concern with Tarzan plus Xiaohu plus Light and Crisp. These are all kind of slower players, and I think that that was definitely something we could have highlighted as an issue, but we all thought that there would be something in here that would be able to break that open. The problem is that is not the case. Now, Tarzan did have a couple of really good aggressive moments in the jungle. I thought he was great in Game 2 on the Maokai. He almost single-handedly won them Game 2, and outside of the completely whiffed melee range Sejuani ultimate, he really wasn't all that bad in Game number 3. The problem is he has no winning lanes right now. If Breathe isn't winning, Light and Crisp aren't exactly dominant laners, and they're certainly not drafting to be dominant laners. Senna, Ezreal, Ziggs, that's the direction you want to go. Okay, forfeit pressure on that side of the map. Well, you gotta win on the top side then, and they didn't. And also, mid's the most important position in the game right now, and Xiaohu looks unplayable. He's going to get dud of the series here. There's just big issues on this team when it comes to them being able to operate in the early game and actually being able to generate resources. And until they solve that, it doesn't matter who's in the lineup. Like, it doesn't matter what jungler is in there trying to enable that. Yeah, could Tarzan be swapped out for maybe a more aggressive jungler and you could see some things improve? Maybe, because playstyle-wise, that could be a bit of a concern. But honestly, Tarzan to me has not been the issue. Xiaohu has been the issue for this team across their first 3 series. I think Breathe needs to win if you're going to draft him. Things like Camille and Vayne on the top side. You cannot lose lane in those matchups. It is utterly, like, pointless to do that. And then if you're going to have Light and Crisp be your most consistent players, you cannot put them on things that have no pressure and have no ability to be played around. These are errors. These are critical errors that I think are holding Weibo Gaming back. And so as much as I would like to side with the LPL fans and simplify it down to, oh, Tarzan or Xiaohu aren't playing well, and so that's why they're losing. It's not as simple as that, and it's rarely as simple as that. It's why I talked about that a lot with Tarzan on LNG, or why I talked about it with Weibo on LNG, why it's never as simple as, oh, X player is playing bad, and that means that they're the problem. Oftentimes, it has a lot more to do with the way things end up going, and so I think Weibo needs a big culture change. They need to figure something out. They need to get more aggressive in some area of the game. They don't have a ton of time to figure that out, but they've got to figure it out soon, or they might not even be top 3 in this group. For Ultra Prime, though, man, if they end up getting top 3, what a ridiculous run for them. I had them in last in terms of my rankings, and that's been a bit of a cursed position for me. It's been a bit of a blessed position for the teams that I put in last, because oftentimes they do a lot better than I'm anticipating. Ultra Prime might just be next in that list. Now, I'm not saying that they're going to go on and finish top 3 in this group. Honestly, I still don't think they will. Like, I think this will fall off. I think that they will come crashing back down to earth at some point, because this is just not sustainable for the talent level on this team. But for now, they actually do look really good, and they may have found a couple of really nice hidden gems in the offseason. All right, but that is going to do it for my LPL Summer Split Placements Week number 1 overview and analysis video. I do hope you guys enjoy it. I hope you enjoyed my analysis, but up on the screen now, you can see the updated standings after 1 week of action, of course, sorted by group. Group A, Group B, Group C, Group D. Remember, in A, B, and C, the top 2 teams go into the upper bracket, the bottom 2 teams go into the lower bracket. In Group D, it's the top 3 teams that end up qualifying for that upper bracket, and the bottom 2 that end up going into that lower group. So definitely want to be in the top 2, and it does feel like, you know, the splits are forming. Not that a ton of them are entirely unexpected, but as you can see on your screen, you can see a couple of things. Not only can you see, of course, all the standings amongst the group, but in the first column to the right, you can see the power ranking column. That's where I personally power rank these teams from number 1 to number 17. The change column is how that has changed from the preseason to after week number 1. So we can go over some risers and some fallers. Generally speaking, Group A just kind of dropping. I don't feel as good about Group A because I think a lot of other teams actually impressed me a lot in week number 1. Teams like FPX, you know, they were fine, and honestly, for the most part, I know I haven't really talked about it in this video, but it's hard not to address it. There have been a lot of controversial things surrounding FPX, and that's a big reason why they drop. You know, what their lineup is going to look like moving forward, we have really no idea, and so because of that, they are going to move down to number 9, although I still think they should be a playoff team, and they looked good enough in week number 1 that I'm not going to punish them too much for whatever is going on off the Rift. EDG dropping down dropping down 1 to number 11 as well, just didn't feel good about them. Thunder Talk dropping down 1, that's not going to shock people. They're one of the worst teams in the LPL right now. Just generally speaking, Group A doesn't feel as strong, and JDG feels very clearly like a team that should just run that group. And then for Group B, we actually have some changes. Bilibili staying in number 1, that shouldn't shock anybody, but WE is going to jump up to number 8. They're going to leapfrog FunPlus Phoenix. I'm going to keep them at 8 for now. I think that there is a very high chance that they end up moving higher than this as the split continues along, because I think they'll be pretty consistent, but I just don't know who is going to continue to struggle, and I want to give some grace to teams that might not have had a great week number 1. But the other 2 teams in this group, not so good. RNG dropping down to number 14. This team has not fixed any of their problems, and LGD dropping down to 16. I think they will be one of the worst teams in the LPL. And then Group C, again, not a lot of changes here. Top Esports going to stick at number 2. LNG going to fall down 1 spot to number 6 in terms of my ranking. I just don't feel particularly good that LNG has solved any of their issues from spring. There are a lot of other teams around them that are still struggling, though, so they stay at number 6. And then Rare Atom actually jumping up 1 to number 12. They looked okay this week. They won against OMG, and I think that that's better than a lot of the other teams from 13 down. And then OMG is going to drop to 13. They lost to Rare Atom, although I think they have some theoretical upside. You know, Angel and Zhao Feng in particular look like players that could still do something. Zhao Feng has been really good this split, but it's just not been enough to win, and that spark is gone, so they are going to fall all the way down to 13. But again, LNG should still be a team that gets out of there in the top 2. And then for Group D, it's all in disarray. Like, this is definitely the most volatile and most interesting group amongst all of them. The team that has now jumped up to the highest power ranking standing for me, Anyone's Legend, jumping up to number 4. This might be premature, but it might not be. I mean, who else do you put above them? They beat Ninjas in Pyjamas, who I have at number 5, going up 1 spot, and so for me, I feel pretty good about AL at 4. NIP is going to go to number 5. Those will probably be the 2 teams right now that are fighting over that 4-5 seed. So it's going to be interesting to watch. But Weibo Gaming dropping down to number 7. Had them at number 4 to start this year. Their problems have been real. Before I drop them down to number 8 or 9 or something like that, I do want to see them struggle for more than just 3 series and more than just the first week. But if they continue to really have issues, if Tarzan and Xiaohu do not click, and if this team does not solve their gameplay problems, then yeah, they're going to continue to move down. Ultra Prime, though, the biggest risers that maybe we've ever had here on the LPL, jumping up 7 spots from number 17 to number 10. It didn't feel like this was going to be possible, but man, so many teams underperformed this week. We knew they would be shooting up. We knew they would be looking a lot better, but even I couldn't have predicted they would move up this much, but really they do feel like the 10th best team in the LPL right now. They are doing things that the teams below them just aren't doing. They are not secure in this spot by any means. Teams like Edward Gaming and teams like Rare Atom could potentially be going up and trying to take that spot from them, but at least for now, they feel better than those teams. They certainly looked better than them in week number 1, so they're going to stay there. And then Invictus falling down to number 17. This feels like the worst team in the LPL right now. I know some people are going to look at how Nenny played that second series and be like, oh, maybe there's something there, but that was literally the only glimpse of life that this entire team had in week number 1, so for me, it felt pretty easy to move them down to 17, but a pretty volatile week number 1. I'm really excited to see where things go from here, but those are my power ranking changes. Let me know what you agree with, what you disagree with down in the comment section below. But it's time to move into my player of the week and my dud of the week here for week number 1. And no major surprises here, I think, from, the people who watched the video. Player of the week for me is going to go to Fofo, the mid laner for Team WE. Great week for WE. They looked really good in their 2 series that they played against LGD and RNG, 2 teams that they should be beating, but Fofo looked amazing in both of those matchups. So much so that he was clearly the choice for player of the week for me. I considered Cream, the mid laner for Top Esports, and of course Kanavi, the jungler for JD Gaming, both of whom also had phenomenal weeks. They're going to be my runners-up, my honorable mentions, but Fofo is going to get my player of the week for week number 1. And then my dud of the week, again, also not a particularly difficult decision. I'm going to give it to Vampire, the support for Invictus Gaming. Just not an LPL caliber player. Like, I know some people are going to want, like, Tarzan or Xiaohu or, one of these higher profile players to get it, but they at least had good games. Vampire got ran off the Rift in every single game that he played. It just was not playable. And for this team to have made the decision to go out and acquire him, trade Wink for him, it's just not a good decision. So Vampire is going to get dud of the week here in week number 1, and Fofo is going to get player of the week in week number 1. But that is going to do it. I do hope you guys enjoyed. If you did, leave a like. It really does mean a lot to me. Lets me know you guys are enjoying the content, and it does help get this video out to a lot more people, which I'm always very appreciative of. If you're new here, hit the subscribe button. We post about the LPL every single week, and we will continue to do so, but we don't only post about the LPL. We post about all 4 of the major regions as well as the NACL every single week on this channel that there are games. So if you're interested in a comprehensive overview of everything going on in LoL Esports, this is the place for it. Hit subscribe and hit that bell so you can be notified when those videos do go live. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all